Recording is on.
Okay, so thank you very much for another edition, and especially I thank Mika for accepting to give a talk to us. So we'll have a guest, a special guest today, uh, Mika Thomas Pimaro from the University of Calabar in Nigeria, who just defended his PhD here in the philosophy department in the University of Bucharest, and who's working on a very interesting project, which is really of interest also for some of our colleagues who have such a project. So please, we can welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so, excuse, excuse me. Richard, thank you for the invitation and thank you everyone for coming. I feel honored when you asked me to come and give a talk today. So, briefly, I want to tell you my background. I teach philosophy at the University of Calabar in Nigeria, and I've been in Bucharest for the past 5 years or so. I study under Michel Dumitru and Stonescu. But then within the 5 years I have been out of Bucharest, I was at iClimate Center in Denmark, where I work with environmental scientists and physicists.
Speak louder, please.
Okay.
Louder.
So where I work with, excuse me, environmental scientists and physicists in Denmark, and after that I went to University of Glasgow, where I also had some research stay for a few months in the School of Sustainability and Education. I proceeded to Newcastle University. I had 1 year at the School of Engineering where I read environmental engineering. And I returned back there last year as a visiting researcher at the Center for Climate and Environmental Resilience. Then my background is strictly philosophy. So during this visit, I discovered that there are so many things we need to bring in while we talk about philosophy. How do we want to make philosophy relevant in the conversation about climate change or ecological crisis? So we have started talking about transdisciplinary philosophy of science and then political philosophy of science to see how we can begin to work with indigenous people and how do we get them involved? How do we have conversation with them on these issues of climate change? Since knowing the fact that climate change affects mostly the indigenous people or the local people. So how do we get their perspective and make it relevant in the conversation? So today, I'll be talking about listening to the Earth's grammar, decolonial anthropomorphism, and relational ecologies. What does it mean? So I want us to briefly imagine for a few minutes that whatever we know apart from ourselves, we lost focus on how to name that particular object. Let's say the dogs, the birds, the environment. Let's just imagine that we cannot be able to name them for a few minutes. Just take your time and then imagine that you've lost your senses of naming those objects. And after that, another come back and imagine that you know what those objects are. It's all about perception. In between the two scenarios, you'll find out that there are some moments you were comfortable in understanding your environment, and there are moments you weren't. Because between the two scenarios, you find out that the first moment you were able to forget the name of your dog, and then maybe you regard the dog as it, or you regard the dog as friend. And then the other time, you may likely recall that out. So this is a thing, and if you regard it as a thing, it means that it's a resources to be used. So let's go into the talk properly. One thing about climate change, or generally the triple plenary crisis, is that it has been discovered or it has been projected that it is a wicked problem. Wicked problem because it has no single solution, which means every perspective is relevant in the conversation about climate change. So this is how bad it is. The fact is that we can't stop the climate from changing. We have passed that stage where we can't stop the climate from changing. What we need to do is to adapt under the hot sun we have created. That's why we keep talking about the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius and then adaptation, resilience, mitigations, and all those things. Now, this is the perspective given by experts. We can see that before 2020, from 1950, those who were born from 1950 to 2020 would have lived 70 years. And those people would have witnessed transition from pre-industrial stability. And then the unprecedented warming then was about +1 degree. And then those who were born in 1980 to 1970, by 2050, they will be like 50 years. So what would they have? I mean, they will be 70 years. What would they have experienced? They weren't born at the peak of the crisis. As you all know, we didn't create the problem we're passing through now. We inherited it. So the ones we are emitting now will be on the future generations. So then those who were born in 2020, by 2090, they'll be 70 years. So those people are the ones that will decide the next generation. Like Ulrich Beck said, they are the ones that are in the rich society. We all find ourselves in the rich society, a society whereby the only thing that we know is the unknown known or the unknown unknowns. And this is the moment where the Socratic dictum of the only thing we know is the fact that we know nothing. Because in the rich society, we keep preparing ourselves, we keep getting ready to make sure that we address risks that we may never see, risks that has never come, risks that may never come. So the thing about climate crisis is that it is a crisis of narrative and it is a crisis of paralysis. Now, how close is the world to its 1.5 degree targets? By our current commitment to cutting down emissions, we say that the current policies where we are now, we are still on 2.5 degrees and we're headed to 2.9 degrees. And then if we at all are serious to take the pledges of 100 billion of climate finances for loss and damages, as was promised in Copenhagen Accord, then probably we will get on to 1.8 degrees or then to 2.1 degrees. But the main target is 1.5 degrees. There's a serious challenge of getting to 1.5 degrees. Of recent, we remember this is the second time like a particular government pulled out from the collective Paris Agreement Accord. So the question now is, what does it mean if our collective future is together? Why should one nation decide to pull out from Paris Agreement that we think will get us to our target of 1.5 degrees? This is the second time it is happening in history. So if we look at the gap between the green and then the blue or the yellow, we'll find out that the climate future shows the cost of inaction. We have been talking so much about climate or ecological crisis, but then the action does not correlate. And that's what I call the crisis of paralysis. We are aware that we need to do this, but our effort towards doing the actions or towards the climate action does not correspond with the problem. Some people will say there's no need to make climate crisis as if it's something that will make human go on extinct. Yeah, we are not saying we will all die, but we are saying it's as bad as we need to talk about it. Even if it will bring up climate anxiety, we need to keep talking about it because our actions matters in the changing climate. Now, across generation narrative and continuity bridges past, present, and future, as we saw in the first graph I showed. And then in framing experience as a coherent story, individuals could gain an ethical understanding of responsibility and agency to make climate action both epistemically informed and morally accountable. Now, today's chat, I will be concentrating on three things. First, I will diagnose the colonial and enlightenment origin of dominant anthropomorphism framework and to show how they shape modern environmental thoughts. And then I will recover and theorize the colonial relational anthropomorphism found in indigenous African and Pacific epistemology as a legitimate mode of ecological relation. Then I'll conclude by suggesting how relational anthropomorphism can guide concrete forms of climate ethics and governance. Now,
should we turn off this? It's too loud, the fan. If you cannot hear.
Can you hear me?
I think.
Oh, so generally, when we talk about anthropomorphism, the traditional understanding of anthropomorphism is projection of human intentions to non-humans. But then in a changing climate, whose anthropomorphism will script the future of the planet? Is it yours? Is it mine? Is it the one for the most vulnerable whose anthropomorphism should matter? But we have long been told that anthropomorphism is a kind of epistemic sin. But here I want to show us that probably there are some good in anthropomorphism. It may lead to ecological empathy. But then we need to understand how to employ it. What if anthropomorphism is the only way we can speak across species? For instance, a story was told of a young lady who gave her life to Jesus Christ, and then she went to church and they said, henceforth, God is your father now. But the girl said, no, I don't want him to be my father. They were like, no, you've given your life to Jesus Christ. God is your father. She said, no. And when they asked her, why are you saying no? She said, no, my father is very evil. He's very wicked. He beats me every day. So if I'm giving my life to Christ and you're telling me God is my father now, it means I have to take my life back because my father is a bad man. So what does it mean? When we are anthropomorphizing, what message are we passing through? Are we passing empathy? If the other agent we're talking about, if we are calling the earth our fatherland, our motherland, what responsibility does it invoke in all of us? And then can empathic and reciprocal anthropomorphism coexist? When we see these beings in the water, when we see the animals people kill, do we really look at their eyes and think, if at all they know what is happening or they know what those people are doing to them? Long ago, the question has never been that do they have life or do they matter, but can they feel pains? In fact, Peter Singer talked about that the major reasons why we should consider, for instance, animal is on the basis of pain. The pain calculus. Should we kill them if they feel pain? Why should we treat them the way we treat them, as objects or as resources? So in this sense, when you are killing a snake, when you are degrading the environment, don't you think the environment also feels and looks at you? So it's another thing we need to understand. And what if the earth also has ears and eyes, and then it could hear us? In Deuteronomy 32, verse 1, those who are good in the Bible, I just got it because I want to give an example. Yeah. So we had where the God of Israel was saying the heaven could listen, and then people can also witness, which means long before now, the earth used to talk or used to listen, but then probably we haven't conditioned ourselves to understand how the earth speaks or how the environment communicates. We have been hearing people saying, I'm going to commune with nature. I'm taking a walk to have an encounter with nature. Because where there is nature, there is beauty. Where there is nature, there is harmony. So have we ever thought of it as anthropologists, as people who care about the environment? Have we ever thought that this environment could also speak? It's just that we do not understand the language. And then if we understand the concept of the Gaia hypothesis, we understand that the environment also has life, it's interconnected, just like the Stoic cosmology, Plato's notion of anima mundi. All these concepts goes to tell us that the environment could feel, could understand, and is interconnected. It's just like the African ontological communitarianism, or what we call Ubuntu. We believe that whatever exists because we exist, and we exist because such thing also exists. So let's think about it anytime we are confronted with issues of environment. But long before now, there has been what I call the colonial capture, which has permeated the conversation about the climate conversation, where people feel that we are superior over the environment. When we think about the universal reason, as Kant said, Kant feel that whatever does not have rationality should not be regarded as reasonable in his categorical imperative. And then when we look at how Adam Smith mapped up the issue of globe, and then he categorized different forms of development. And also the man as the measure of all things of Protagoras. They feel that man is the measure of all things, which is purely relative, that apart from man, nothing exists. Man decides what matters, what exists. So such reasoning have permeated environmental conversation for long and then has serious consequences on how we take climate action. Then we also look at the great chain of being where I said we have the hierarchy versus causal connection. We could see that in the great chain of being, God is up and then every other being, every other thing comes down. But then at the same time, there is causal connection between the lower being and the higher being. In as much as there is hierarchy, which will cause division, there's also causal connection. Because from down you get to the top, there's a connection between humans and bees, between beasts and plants, between God and angels and heavens. So it's caused a kind of paradox. Then we have Sylvia talked about coloniality of being, because for her, the overrepresentation of one model of man as the measure of the world within this grammar resemble European rationality, because everything else, including the colonized, the animal, the land, was a deviation, a specimen, or a resources. It's just, you agree with me, during the slave trade, human beings are treated as properties because when you purchase a slave, you treat the slave as much as you want. Whatever you want, the slave does for you. So in this sense, man is positioned as the measure of all value, determining who count as fully human. And those, unlike man, are cast as lesser or colonized people. Animals and land become objects or resources. A man is defined as the supposedly universal human model on European or Eurocentric rationality. So this system sustains global hierarchies by treating man's traits as natural and everyone else as deviation. I would like to pause here if there's any interjection before I continue. Do I go ahead? Okay. So I would want to introduce us to the concept of idle growth, awaiting rational management. So there was a forest in Western Africa, in Nigeria. So it's majorly the British botanists who went to the forest and then saw the beautiful forest and said that, oh, this is a forest. They tag it as an idle growth waiting for rational management. So as at that point, they believed that such forest does not have rationality, and then they looked at it as a resources. But prior to that, the people of that area who inhabited the forest and the river knew that this place served as a very important place for them, for their ancestors, where trees were not resources, but they were persons with agency, and they also have responsibility, reciprocal responsibility. As they give, they also receive back from the land. But colonial forestry erased these grammars in favor of measurable yield and timber value, simply because when they got to the forest, they wanted to harness the resources, and then they also, it's an idle growth. It doesn't have rational management. Also, the mechanistic view of Descartes, which explained the behavior of animals, including human, employing mechanical principle. Descartes' mechanistic view construed animal as automated lacking consciousness, reducing behavior to mechanical process. This stance challenges anthropomorphic tendency to ascribe human-like mental states to non-human creatures, insisting instead of strict physiological explanation. He denies animal thoughts and discourages projecting subjective experiences across species. As we all know, René Descartes is regarded as the one who came with the problem of mind-body. So this kind of reasoning is mechanistic, and it has implication of towards environmental thinking. Because when you feel that your body is different from your soul, the treatment you give to the other tells how you reason. Now, has anthropomorphism vanished under current science? We have the traditional notion of science where Thomas Kuhn talked about in his structure of scientific revolution. Now, in the present conversation under climate science, do we think anthropomorphism vanished? In cognitive ethology, we see how researchers use strategic anthropomorphism to make cautious inferences about animal intentions. And it works because it involves the sense of ecological empathy. In behavioral ecology, we see how scientists adopt human lifetimes such as signals or decisions while rigorously bracketing assumption. And in robotics and AI research, we see how human traits are projected onto machines, which require constant methodological discipline. Current science has not eliminated anthropomorphism, it has transformed it, negotiating rather than abolishing human-centered projection. So they discovered that if we could use anthropomorphism to make people feel empathy towards the environment, towards animals, we would have achieved a lot. So instead of abolishing, they transform it into a very useful stuff. Now, the persistence of human-centered perception, it will continue even after that, because anthropomorphic metaphors in several instances help to grasp complex climate system. Mike Holm notes that climate is often portrayed as having moods, intention, or warning, rhetorical moves that make abstraction relatable in public discourse. And also, climate advocacy leverage personification to mobilize affect. The phrase Mother Earth or Father Earth or Dying Planet appears widely in environmental movement to generate emotional identification and ethical responsibility. Because when you feel that the land is your mother, you know the responsibility you owe to your mother. As a matter of fact, you have a duty and the responsibility to ensure the continuation or the survival of your mother. And then also in policy debates, anthropomorphism or anthropomorphic significance is used to assign blame or agency, because this shows that climate narrative often speak of the planet as punishing or correcting us, shaping political imaginaries. Now we move to what I call the decolonial counter-anthropomorphism. Now I said the world has always spoken otherwise, even though we saw that long before now we had mechanistic views from Descartes, from Kant, and several other researchers across indigenous and African cosmologies. We find anthropomorphism that refuse hierarchy and invite relation. How can we make anthropomorphism relatable? Because the issue with the climate crisis is that its impacts are felt unequal. And the irony is that those who contributed more are not the ones at the receiving end. And if we continue to get policies from top, we will continue also to jeopardize the life of the most vulnerable, because those who bring the policy are not those who suffer most. So it is important for us to invoke relational ethics to ensure that those who are the most vulnerable, their perspective should be brought on table. And let's get to know what policies they have and how have they, prior to now, managed their environment. Because they have their own local indigenous knowledge, how they have conserved the forest, how they've conserved the planet, how they've conserved every resources they ever had. Now we have the Kasok Saka Saraiku forest, and after a decade of facing industrial development and pressures, in 2018, these people took a historical step when they traveled to the Ecuadorian capital to officially present their case. And then, at long run, this forest is recognized as a living forest. So they have what they call the declaration, the Living Forest Declaration, where that our living territory is and will continue to be free of any type of extractive activities such as oil, mining, wood extraction, biospiracy, or other similar activities. The declaration asks for national and international recognition of a new legal framework or category for the permanent protection of indigenous land, free of industrial extraction, and with policies for sustainable hunting, fishing, agriculture, housing, transportation, and traditional medicine. So this is one example of how relationality could help us address climate crisis. Then also in the unit Arctic, these people mostly live in the Arctic, and then their relation with fish and seals reflects kin-based ontologies which shape social order. They treat these beings as relatives, just like St. Francis of Assisi said, The animals and the environment are my brothers and sisters in Christ Jesus. So that's what they believe, that everything that is living around them, either animals, the environment, the forest, are their brothers and sisters. So they don't harm them. A scholar called Todd brought a concept of fish pluralities, which is like a concept of co-producing governance by acting as agents in legal and ecological decision making. So every part of the community has been recognized as an actor in co-producing governance for sustainability. So such multi-species participation could stabilize community norms and environmental stewardship. And then in West Africa, we have similar grammars that endure. For instance, among the Yoruba people of Nigeria, we have a river called Oshun or Ogun, and then the Imoja. These are natural features, but they have deities, living agents whose moods, songs, and flutes carry moral force. Anthropomorphism here is not projection, but recognition. While the traditional notion of anthropomorphism feels we are projecting our intentions on forests, on waters, on our environment, in typical Yoruba land, it is recognition of those agents. And then the forests are seen as agents. They are not properties to be used. Because people go to this forest, go to the water, and commune with nature. You go there and then pray to the goddess of the river for blessings. And when you leave, it happens. I don't know if it is superstition or not, but it works for them. Which means they have their basic ecological knowledge prior to the climate crisis. So we see that the Oshun Oshogo festival suggests that communal identity is reinforced through shared performance that bind participants to ancestral narrative. The prominence of Oshun implies that cosmological beings function as active partners in sustaining social cohesion. And then the groves, sacred status support the hypothesis that ritual space regulates ecological ethics. Its Pan-African appeal indicates that Heritage Festival mobilizes cultural memory to negotiate modernity because people travel across the globe to attend this festival, which is annual. And then they go, some of them live in Europe, some of them live in America, but when they get home, they go to these rivers and then they go to the goddess and they speak to the goddess and they get the blessings of the river. So it means there is something we need to learn from the indigenous people. And then also we have the Shona cosmology that integrates landforms with ancestral presence, which suggests that legal authority is partly grounded in territorial spirituality. And to them also, their forests are sacred because they function as judicial site where ancestors mediate social order, which implies that environmental governance is inseparable from moral kingship. And then we have the ritual permission before felling trees. You can't fell a tree in this community if you don't perform ritual, because the trees are very important to them and they don't see them as just properties. If you want to take it, it should be for the good of the entire community. And violating sacred sites demonstrate that ecological harm simultaneously constitutes a breach of customary law, and it reveals an integrated eco-legal system. It's just like when I made mention of Ubuntu, I am because you are because I am. So such ontology, the ontology of connectedness, means that by the time you degrade the environment, you are cutting short your own life because you exist because there is community, there is an environment, and whereby the environment is not honored, is not taken care of, you are also not taking care of yourself. Now, how do we make sure that across different disciplines and then across different communities we speak the same anthropomorphic language? How can we turn it to transdisciplinary exercise? So I target from projection to resonance. Now, modern science too is beginning to rediscover resonance because we see neuroscientists studying mirror neurons to find that empathy is not a high-level moral faculty, but a bodily resonance, which defies the Kantian notion earlier of rationality. And then humans or primates, even octopus, share cycles that fire when witnessing another's pain or joy. Also, mirror neurons may enable automatic understanding of others' actions by eternally simulating observed behavior as suggested. Last year and this year, I taught a course at the University of Booker as a visual reality, where we imagine how we get immersed in the visual environment and if such behavior could invoke empathy. When you see yourself being immersed in the visual world, how do you feel? Does it bring some feelings of empathy or of violence? Or because you could put that VR and then you see what happens on the streets of Gaza, what happens in Ukraine, what kind of feelings do you have? That's very important. So we can see that even in climate conversation now, different form of sciences are using that to make sure that we move from projecting our own intentions onto others into genuine conversation on how can we address this. And we could agree that their contribution is very important to empathy because it implies that social bonding emerges from neural mirroring of others' emotions. And that could reduce mirror system activity in autism, for instance, which suggests that social cognitive difficulties stem partly from impaired action and intention mapping. Now, let's consider the Pacific voyaging traditions of the Pimaro and Polynesian navigators. For them, the ocean speaks, the swell has moved, and the wind gives counsel. And the navigators read the sea not as data but as dialogue. Because whenever they want to sail, they sit and then they try to understand how the ocean behaves. Because sometimes they say the ocean rolls, and you could see even during Jesus Christ, we learned that there was a time he was going and the sea was misbehaving to the level he had to make sure that the sea stops when he spoke and then calm the storm. So these people also looked at all those things not as data but as dialogue because they can converse with the waters. In Africa, we have people we call rainmakers. They can stop the rain and they can make the rain. So in such instances, we see that people do not see all what the science is as data, but they believe that it's conversation, dialogue. Because this attentiveness is a neurological and ecological spiritual practice as one, and it shows continuous tuning of body and the world. Also, the Fulani herdsmen in the Sahel and Africa, we see these people understand the season. And this reminds me of the notion of time in traditional or African metaphysics. Because in traditional African metaphysics, time is only measured by events, not like the Eurocentric notion of time. What we believe as time is just an event. We don't have like 16th of July 2026. What we have is maybe 5 market days. So without event, there is no time. And this is the same thing that happens with the Fulani herdsmen. They read the cattle behavior, the wind shift, and bird migration as communicative forms of guidance about drought, pasture, and time. They will tell you we will be living after the bird's migration. This practice are planetary intelligence because they hone long before satellite data. So to anthropomorphize resonantly is to restore relational between sensory and planetary intelligence and to feel with the world at the level of vibration. A glacier's roam, an elephant's infrasound, a moon's songs, which rhythm all become voices in the polyphonic earth. Now, relational empathy for ecological future. What will it mean to translate this relationality into practice? When some people speak to the waters not as data but as dialogue, what does it mean? First, we must delink from the colonial body as machine of Descartes, or the mechanistic dualism, and the IPCC framing of human influence. The climate crisis has been framed for a very long time as majorly anthropogenic. Of course, the planet will warm, whether we put our effort on it or not, but it's just that it has never warmed in the quantum we are experiencing now. So we also have to delink ourselves from that major framing, because the problem is not simply carbon. It is the ontology of separation that produces carbon. We have been talking about carbon budgets. It will get exhausted. We have now to 2030 for it to get exhausted. But should we keep concentrating on the concerns of carbon budget or our relationship with our environment? Yes, we may decide to cut down all our emissions, but will that stop the planet from warming henceforth? Second, we need to relate with modern human bodies as partners in world making, what Donna Harry calls the making king, or as being who enter politics on their own terms. This could be like a contractual stuff, not really like in the state of nature. But then in 2022 at the COP27, the Secretary of the United Nations made mention of solidarity pact. So it could be something similar to that. But on what basis can we frame that? Now, Harry's idea of making king support the hypothesis that climate relations improve when humans treat more than human beings as co-creative partners rather than passive resources. And then Cadena's account of Earth being suggests that non-humans can act politically, implying that environmental governance must recognize their agency. So linking with these entities may cultivate alternative world-making practices in which ecological stability emerges from multi-species collaboration rather than human exceptionalism. Third, we must transduce empathy into material protocols. We have to have what we call the legal personhood for rivers, just like we have in New Zealand and then Colombia. And we also have to make reparations for petroculture to acknowledge oil extraction as a colonial wound. Unfortunately, even the regular COPs we used to have, COP 30, I think is still ongoing, we still see that global leaders, those who are captains of fuel industry, fossil fuel industry, are still chairing committees, and then we are talking about getting to 1.5 degrees. So if we want to translate such relationality, we need to understand that such are still colonial issues. Carbon taxation must also be tied to indigenous stewardship metrics so that relational knowledge not cooperate offset only but guide predatory repairs. Now, the issue of climate change generally, when we see it, we know that it's brought issues about value, and then we have different perspectives. And the challenge has always been that will there ever be a time when all of us will sit together and agree on what to do, when to do, and how to do about climate change or the environment? Can we ever agree on this is the single action we need to take? It may be difficult, but it's not impossible. So the notion of post-normal science came into being, which was propounded by Funchwick and Rabbit. This is like advancing the notion of science in Thomas Kuhn's traditional scientific methodology. Funchwick and Rabbit believe that when decision stakes and uncertainty are low, science is routine and safe, such as in testing the breach. And then when stakes and uncertainty are moderate, expert debates and peer review are needed, such as medical trials. And when stakes and uncertainty are high, as in concerns of environmental policy or climate policy, science alone is not enough. So they call that framework post-normal science. So what we need at that moment is peer community that should include locals and stakeholders, not just lab. At this moment, the conversation goes outside the laboratory. It has moved into what is called the marketplaces, where we all have to recognize the perspective of those who are most affected. For instance, if we have a farmer who is in Constanta or a fisherman, you can agree with me that he knows better the season in that area than any scientist that will ever come there to say it. And then we also know the issues we have with climate modeling. Do they capture all experiences and translate it into issues? Those are serious challenges. We have a proverb that said you don't need to be a shoemaker to know your shoe size. Everyone goes to the market. I am my shoe size is 41, is 30, is this. You are not a cobbler, but you know your shoe size. So it means that you don't have to be a scientist, but you know how the climate crisis affects you. You know how the environmental issues affect you. When I came to Bucharest newly, I learned that we used to have a lot of snow in Bucharest. People who live longer could attest to that. But suddenly we are having a drier winter, and then we are having a warmer summer, which means that something is getting wrong. Conversation about these things will require knowledge of those who have been there, who felt it, even though they don't have the expert knowledge. Now, Fontuwick and Ravel says where we have issues that we hardly agree on it, and then the decision is urgent, we need to make decision, and different perspective and concerns of value, we need to employ the post-normal approach where we have the extended peer communities that can also be involved. So at that moment, we are at the stage of ignorance because we don't know it. We have to bring different people to the table to have a conversation with them and have an extended peer community. That can be seen in West Africa, for instance, where we may imagine customary ecological courts or hybrid assemblies where elders, ecologists, and river priests deliberate on environmental harm. This will not replicate Western law, it will pluralize and democratize it. For instance, there's a notion of the palaver tree where people come and sit under and negotiate issues. We have the square, we have where people come and say, okay, this is my concern. What do we do about it? Everyone comes under a palaver tree, sit down, and then bring different perspectives to ensure that the conversation capture their own concerns and priorities. Because if we are continuing with using the Eurocentric notion of climate action, we may not get the result. To someone who is in Bucharest or who is in Denmark, Copenhagen, climate change does not mean the same thing to someone who is in Nigeria on the streets of Lagos. There are two different scenarios. And what is the essence of climate action when someone is outside there and cannot feed? So that's where we have to look at priorities. And that's when the Thomas Malthus theory of hierarchies of needs is very important. What I need in the climate crisis or in the environmental crisis is not what you need. So how do we get our perspective and address it as a genuine climate conversation or action? The point is not to romanticize tradition, but to recover epistemic sovereignty, to let local grammars of empathy enter plenary governance. Because when we bring people from different perspectives, their own view can be useful. We can begin to have policies from bottom top instead of top down approach. So it will be bottom top approach. Of course, UNEP has identified this, that what is needed now is integration of local knowledge. We have to bring different knowledge from different people who have been vulnerable over the time to include it in climate conversation. And we should also understand that the climate crisis, after all, is not only atmospheric, it is ontological. It arises from forgetting the world is alive. Because when we till the ground, when we harm the forest, when we do different things to the environment without bothering, it will come back to us. Of course, what we are suffering from now, we didn't cause it, but we are also contributing to what the future generation will inherit. So, on the long run, whose anthropomorphism will shape the future? Is it ours? Is it for the future generation themselves? Like during the COVID, there was a documentary I watched that says the world regained itself because the whole was shut down at a point, and then people were not going out. So when people came out, when people were not coming out, you could see some of the wild animals coming, and then the environment became beautiful, which means that the environment can do without us. But immediately the COVID went up, we came out and started our normal routine of degenerating the environment, and we lost it because when we see the graph during the COVID, we were making so much progress. Flights were not going, and then so many activities that we used to emit the atmosphere were not in use, and then the environment started regaining, rejuvenating. When we came back, we now returned back to our normal world. So whose anthropomorphism will shape the future? The colonial grammar has already spoken. Its language is extraction. Its punctuation is drought, flood on the streets of different communities in Africa and the global south. But other grammar persists, like the Yoruba songs to Oshun, or the Tangora on the inner stories of the Seal Kings, or the Amazonian prayers to the forest spirit, where people don't no longer see issues about water, drought as data, but as dialogue, as conversation. Each of those perspectives articulate a truth modernity for God, that we live within the body of the world, not above it. And to decolonize anthropomorphism then is not to abandon science, but to expand sensibility, to listen for the earth's symptoms of survival. How has it been talking to us? How has it been talking to people prior to us? And our task is not to end anthropomorphism, but to choose the right one, to replace the gaze of mastery with the air of relation. We have to understand that projecting our intention on them will no longer hold. Let's begin to recognize them. And then the storm is already speaking, because the question is whether we are all still capable of hearing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I open the Q&A session. Please, I will look online if there are participants who want to ask questions. And yes, we have here, please.
When you gave us this talk on anthropomorphism, I was reminding myself about the Greek philosophical relationship or concept between microcosmos and macrocosmos, man and cosmos. My question is, in the African context, do you see that relationship a relationship of difference or a relationship of identity, a relationship which is deeper, like the animistic relationship between? How would you see it?
So in traditional African society, the emphasis on traditional is because African society is also becoming modernized with the coming of Christian religion, Islamic religion. The traditional African religion has been politicized and corrupted. But in the traditional African setting, the relationship between man and the environment is sacred and is reciprocal. What you give is what you receive. The environment gives you life, and you also give life to the environment. So harming any part of the environment is harming yourself. But then with the coming of Christian religion, we know the notion of the dominion, that I have given you the land to plow, to dominate, and that. So some people feel that whatever is given to them apart from themselves, they have the power and the duty to use it as they wish. Unfortunately, the environmental or ecological crisis has made us understand that we no longer need to do that. So still in Africa, most African societies, the relationship between them and the environment is one that is interconnected. And one harm to the environment means harm to humanity in itself.
And is there any relationship of freedom between man and cosmos, or it's intimate and bound
It's
into a close?
Yes, so mostly in traditional African society, it's intimate, it's bound. But then with so many African communities now have deviated from tradition, they move into religion, and then they don't see it as intimate. They believe that I am not connected to my environment, whatever I want to do, I'm free to do it.
Because even the relationship of dominion, the Western concept implemented there, of influencing this cosmos, it's still naturalistic
Yes.
because it's about survival of the fittest, dominion.
Yeah.
But that is not the relationship of difference
Yeah.
I'm talking about.
So, but then the way it's, the process theology, the way they keep translating the notion also has a lot of implication, because some people feel that when we have dominion, it means we can do and undo on that particular object, which it's also translated to stewardship in some other cases. But majorly, it's like not stewardship, but then it's having the resources and then do whatever you want to do with the resources. So that there is a sense of freedom in some aspect, and then others is still into. Yeah.
Thank you. Please, again.
Thanks. I appreciate this effort of saving anthropomorphism from the kind of sentence of irrationality to which colonial take on human relations has condemned it. And so I really enjoyed the take, and it's pretty much in resonance with the sort of literature that I've been reading for the past decade or so. But I would have just a couple of questions that target the applicability of this mode of thought that I share. So on the one hand, there is this question of translatability when it comes to, say, radically different ontologies.
Yeah.
So this was one of the problems, right, raised by the perspectivist sort of approach, right? So is there the possibility to translate one worldview into the other, and who is supposed to be doing this kind of work? That is difficult, that it's kind of embedded in power relations, and that is, well, maybe unlikely to succeed, right? So let's put it this way. I cannot live in a world, right, where witches are causal actors, because that would demolish pretty much the entire justice system based on rationality and evidence on which my society kind of hinges. Right? At the same time, it would be difficult to move from a relational to kind of translate or bring forth kind of relational ontology with natural elements in societies that are completely premised on radical separation that allows for exploitation and destruction. So one of the questions would be, how can this translatability, translation enacted? Who is supposed to be doing it and at what level? Yeah. And secondly, in the most ideal of worlds, such a shift in worldview would be quite a long process, right? We're already on a path for a significant overshoot, right? So we're right now on the path of going well above 2 degrees Celsius, right? So, I suppose my question is also about timing, right? So what you are suggesting is basically a grand scale moral revolution, which would be absolutely fantastic, right? But at the same time, we are quite in a state of urgency. Right? So how do you square this sort of slow process of translating and shifting worldviews with the absolute emergency of acting upon climate change now? Thanks.
Thank you. Does anybody want to interject, or I should go ahead? Okay, so like I said, while talking about post-normal science, it says that post-normal science is accurate when we have issues that are urgent, that decision is urgent, stakes are high, and we have concerns for value. And then the major thing about the post-normal science is having an extended peer community, different from the normal or the traditional notion of scientific community. This is an extended peer community where we have the possibility of a cobbler scientist, a builder scientist, a fisher scientist, a woman scientist, whoever has any experience of the crisis can also have a voice. It's just like having a table we sit here, everyone from different walks of life come and give their view. I know that there is concern for power asymmetries and the challenges of implementation and transparency. But then, UNEP has identified that what we need now is how do we integrate local knowledge? Because most issues of climate change we're talking about, the most vulnerable are those of the global south. They are local people. But then they have been able to preserve their environment prior to now for a very long time. How do we go back and start getting those knowledge, the local ecological knowledge, to use? And that will translate into countering the already existing top-down approach to now down-top approach. It's going to be difficult, but not impossible. But if we imagine where we have every community representative, not general, maybe people from the global south on the IPCC table, bringing their perspective and their views, that may go a long way in changing some of the things. But it's difficult to have them. And I'm not saying we may not have them in the future. We may definitely have someday. But the most important thing is when we have an extended peer community, those views can be translated from local to global. Of course, the crisis, we are living in a global world now. What affects us here affects the people in the global south. Because if we don't address it as global north, we will end up having climate refugees coming here and taking over our land. So that's why it is important to know that we can also get some knowledge from local and translate it into global. We have seen that some forests have received declaration of legitimacy that they have their right and nobody can go. And climate litigation has also gone a long way. People have been winning cases, several issues regarding environmental harms. That can also be used, and possibly we can invoke that into whatever decision we are making in climate policy. So I think it's not impossible, but it's just that are we ready to do that? We may not be ready, but we need to do it. It's important that we do it because we don't have time. We need to act, and the time to act is now. So that would be my take on the question.
Thank you. Other questions from the room or from online?
Questions or interjection, that would be fine.
Yes. You want?
Okay,
Yeah, please.
Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for the thought-provoking presentation. It was really great to listen for the situations outside of Europe, outside of Nigeria. Definitely the principle of anthropomorphism that you mentioned here, as well as all this traditional understanding that you mentioned in your presentation is of help when it comes to actually raising the awareness and doing something in this effort to reduce the global challenges like the ecological challenges you already mentioned. But at the same time, we know the reality is very harsh. As a matter of fact, I happen to be in Nigeria 2 times so far, and I had the chance to spend some time in very remote areas of Nigeria, not necessarily in the capital city. So it was the Yorubas, it was the Hausa. So I had a general picture during the time I lived here. I lived there. Of course, it might be subjective coming from a person that had just visited the place, did not do proper research and so on. But the first impression you get in those very remote places is that the economical conditions are very harsh. And there is basically no concern about protecting the environment, about ecology, because you already mentioned that people have other priorities in the end. So you look at the way villages are organized, you look at the fact that people have concerns like lack of education, like no access to running water, food, all the rest. the way the environment is exploited. All these things do not speak at all about any concern in this respect. This was my impression. So you touched upon it already about the priorities and all the rest. So of course, before everything else, people have to survive. Have to look at those minimum necessary conditions to stay alive, let's say, to have shelter, education, and all the rest. And to make things more complicated in Nigeria, we know that basically the whole country sits on big ores of very important minerals, gold, and all the rest. There are lots of interests, there are lots of disputes. You know much better than me, of course. So my question is, in this respect, in this context, in this environment, how much people still care about tradition, about this anthropomorphic understanding of the environment, how much dialogue there really is. You mentioned two cases. Are those really isolated cases? Are they widespread in the people's mentality? In the end, we talk about more than 200 million people. So, do people really resonate at this time? What do they see between this understanding, this scientific, Eurocentric, Western-centric understanding, and the traditional understanding?
Yeah, thank you. I think the major problem, like the case I mentioned, it's mostly in the western part in Yoruba. There may be other similar stuffs like that in other part of the country, since it's a large country. And then I just wanted to pick one example. The issue with Nigerians per se, just since you have visited and saw how the issue is, we have high level of literacy. And then, like I said about priorities, you don't tell someone who is trying to survive to preserve the environment or to stop bush burning. To him, it doesn't even make sense. He has to cut all the trees and make sure he has shelter. So that is why there is a strong connection between poverty, literacy, and the climate or general ecological crisis. We cannot say we want to preserve the environment when we are unable to eradicate poverty. We are also not able to educate people about the climate crisis. Majorly, people don't even know what the crisis is all about. So you need to educate them. I think the UK government now has made it possible for people to start getting environmental illiteracy. So we need such revolution before we even start talking about how people can understand anthropomorphism. They don't even have the knowledge. So, and then when they don't have the knowledge, they can do what they want to do with the environment, and they feel like it's okay. It's just like when the concern for the carbon budget came up, the global South insisted that we cannot cut down our emissions because we also need to develop to the level where Europeans are before we start talking about carbon budget. Because if you say we should just stop emitting by 2030, we haven't gotten to the level where we can start using electric cars. If you've been to Nigeria, you see that electricity is a major problem. So if you ship 1,000 electric vehicles to Nigeria, they won't function because we don't even have stable electricity. So those are some of the issues. So tackling the ecological crisis alone cannot help. We have to tackle it alongside issues that affect humanity because we are interconnected at the end. That would be my take on that. I don't know if I answered.
Yes. But I'm just considering from a teenager's perspective, let's say somewhere in a remote village in northern Nigeria. Is he aware of this traditional understanding? Is it passed from one generation to the next? And does it imply it's somewhere, at least the theoretical aspect, important here, somewhere there in his mind, despite the fact he doesn't meet his necessary
needs? Yeah, so like in the western part, like in the ocean, it's an annual event that is passed from generation to generation. It has been for over 100 years. And people still do it, except people who hold on to religion now and they feel that we don't want to be part of traditional African activities. But it has been there. And then in the northern Nigeria, probably there may be some things like that. I haven't researched on it, but I am sure about the Yorubas and then the Igbos, because I know it has been passed from generation to generation, where people still believe that they have strong link with the ancestors, going to the river, going to the forest, preserving them, and then going back there to get all what they want to get from the goddess. So it's passed from generation to generation. But then, unfortunately, it's not translated into, let's say, global language that can be adopted. Yeah.
Thank you. If there are online, Dragos, you wanted to add something? Okay. You can see them for your yes, to get out of the view.
I'll just stop sharing first.
Yeah. Never mind. There is no question online, I think. I will ask you if there are no more questions. One question also.
Okay.
I get it a bit philosophical because we are on the same right philosophy.
Yeah.
So if you said that decolonizing anthropomorphism will mean to expand sensibility.
Yeah.
And then my question would be, is there here also a place for rationality? And if you get the rationality, then what kind would be, and would this open the door of relativism, or how do you negotiate this?
Yeah, so mostly when we said expanded it, when we talk about relationality, questions of relativism come up. But then when we talk about reciprocal grounding, especially from the metaphysical aspect, we see that coherentism can eradicate relativism. Because generally, when you look at like perspectivism of Nietzsche, you could see that he has been able to stress how we can navigate relativism. When you come from your point of view, and I come from my point of view, and he comes from his point of view, we are now coming together with different perspectives. It is not relativism like in case of Protagoras that man is the measure of all things that are the ones that are not. In this case, every view counts and every view is legitimate. So such relationality cannot lead us to relativism. But it's just that it will expand the moral cycle because every view will be respected, will be legitimate. So the question is, can we make that a procedure or can we legalize that? That will be the major challenge. But then when we have extended peer communities and every view is brought on table, we will be able to navigate relativism. Because we are not holding on to only your view, but we are getting everybody's view. It's like everyone is involved in it.
Yeah, but you need a frame to put this, or a frame in which you would put this, and this would give you the frame of rationality, and how do you build it, right, for people.
Yes,
can also evaluate
we can have a
each of the views, right? They don't come and they are not there. You can take them as you evaluate or you put them together in a way, right?
Yeah, so in this case, I think every view is legitimate because it comes from the point of experience, lived experience, and then where we bring concerns about lived experience. If I say this is how I feel and understand climate change, I won't be wrong from saying that because I know how I feel it. And I know it from my own experience. So it is legitimate to me. The only concern would be how can we translate that into a global framework. But then within this conversation, I think it's important to know that it won't lead us to relativism because we are getting everybody's view and we are trying to understand the crisis from that perspective. We are not imposing our view. Yeah. We are taking the person's view and making sure that we make use of it in our conversation.
Okay, thank you. If there are no questions anymore, then let's thank our invitee. Thank you also online. So we go. Thank you. Bye.